If you have an app that connects to an API, as most apps do, then you might want to have something set up so you can force a user to upgrade to a new version. I'm going to show you how to make this force prompt update page, which is going to connect both to the Apple App Store and the Android Play Store and allow them to update it directly. From the simulator here, the links actually won't load up, but if you were to do this on an actual device, it would work. In addition to having this forced update, we're also going to set it up so you can put a suggested update, and that would look like this. If you have a update that is not required for the user to do, but you can show them, hey, you can get new versions of the app, and this again will link to that app store. And then of course, if the user is on the current version, they would just see nothing and your app would load as expected. So we'll get right into it with a brand new Flutter project, and this I have just removed comments from main and pubspec.yaml. I'll have all of this code linked below. The one thing to notice here is the version number. This build number here is going to be what we're using to track if a version that a user has is too outdated. So when you are deploying your app, you should be using a build version that is always incrementing. And this tutorial is going to assume that every time you deploy a new version, this number is going to increase. A little bit more prerequisites that you will need before doing this. We are going to be using Riverpod and the repository pattern, which is outlined in this blog, which I'll also link below. And if you're not familiar with the repository pattern, then I would definitely recommend reading through this blog. And if you want an even further deep dive, then I would recommend the course by Andrea, the Flutter Foundations course. So I'm not going to cover extensively how this is set up. I'm going to kind of assume you know what the repository pattern is and also that you know how to use Riverpod with the generators, although I will kind of show you how to get Riverpod installed and just do the basics with that. So let's begin by actually creating some of these files that we're going to use and then writing some code. Within the lib folder here, we're going to create a new file, and it is going to be actually within a few folders. So we're going to create an src and then features, and then we're going to create a feature here called updates, which is going to house all of the code for this feature. Within the updates, we're going to first create the data layer, which is going to be our updates repository .dart. Since this is a brand new project, it looks pretty unnecessary to have that many files, but as the project grows, this does become very useful. Within the updates repository, we're just going to create a class called the update repository. And now within here, we want to create a function where we can get the device build number. So if you remember from our example, we actually are printing out the current build. And as I said before, that build version is going to be this number right here. So once we get this set up, we would expect a 1 to be printed there. So to get this build number, we're going to be using a package called package-info+. So we can copy this and then go ahead and add it to our project here. And once we have that, we can create this simple function, which is just going to be a feature which returns an integer, which is going to be that integer value of our build number. So we do need to also import the package-info+. And then we're going to be using that package-info package to essentially parse out the build number. The next step is to actually get that displaying on the screen here. We can actually use Riverpod now to create a future provider to give us this information and then read it within our build home widget here. First, we will need to install Riverpod, and we will be using the Riverpod generators. So there's 4 total packages we're going to need. 2 of them are going to go in the regular dependencies, and that is going to be Flutter Riverpod and Riverpod annotation. And then there's 2 more that we're going to have in the dev dependencies, which is going to be the build runner and the Riverpod generator. So the build runner is going to allow us to use the Riverpod generator, and the Riverpod generator just makes our code much cleaner and easier to read. Once we have those installed, we can start the generator, which we can do within the terminal here. And we're just going to run dart run build runner watch-d. And this is going to start up that generator. Back over in our updates repository, we can add this line up here, which is part, and then we're going to write the name of the file, which is updates repository.g.dart. And this is going to tell this file that there is generated code involved. Now we can create that Riverpod provider. And first we're going to create a provider for the actual repository itself. And if we go ahead and save this, now that we have our generator here, all these updates should take place and we should have our code generated. It does look like actually I called this class update repository, but I do want that to be updates repository. So once that's saved, you can see we get a new file generated down here, which is just our entire Riverpod provider. Now that we have this provider, and do note that this is a keep alive true because we really want this data to be read essentially once when the app loads and then not have to be called every time again. So we can't keep this alive for the entirety of the app. Now though, we want a future provider, which is going to give us that future of the device build number. So this is simply a provider that is going to return the value in this function. But with this provider, we can go and use it in our view to display what this integer is. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So we can go over into main. First thing we need to do with using Riverpod is to wrap our app here in a provider scope. So we can wrap this in a widget, and that will be the provider scope. And then we will need to import the Riverpod package. That is good. And now we can go ahead and actually display that value from the future provider that we just created. So within our column here, we're going to use a Riverpod consumer, and then we need to give it the builder and then listen to that provider that we created. It is going to be returning an async value of type int. And this will be the current build. So we're also going to have to import the reference to the update repository there. We are not going to be able to access that future directly. So we will have to listen for when that current build, which is this async value, has data. And then when it does have data, we're going to return that current build and that value. And that value will just be, of course, the integer. If it's loading, we can add a circle progress indicator, and then if there is an error, we can just display the error. I believe if we save this now and reload it, we will have an error, and that is because this app needs to be restarted, but you can see the error is being displayed here. And this is expected because the app was already running, so we do need to go ahead and run that again. All right, and once this loads back up, you can see we do get that current build, which is just a 1. And if we do go ahead and change this to a 2 here, again, you are going to have to completely rebuild the app. And that is, of course, because hot reload is just reloading the app, not rebuilding the app. And when you do change the version number, you do need to rebuild the app completely. So when we reload it this time, we will expect it to say 2. And this is just going to confirm that this version number here, this build version, is what's being displayed from that future provider. And there you go, it is 2, so that looks good. All right, so now that we're able to access the build number on the current device, we're going to need a way to determine if the user's current build number is out of date or if it's behind the most recent version. So to do this, you can just create a simple API endpoint, and I'm not going to talk specifically about the backend that you use. So you can do this with any backend. Let me show you an example with a custom backend that I'm using. So this is a Django built custom backend, and I have one endpoint here, which is just called BuildVersions. And within this, I simply am returning 2 values, which is the minimum build and the deployed build. And you can see right now they're both set to 26. So if you're not on version 26 in this example, you will be prompted to force update. Setting this up should be relatively easy if you do have an API set up already. You just need a way to return 2 values. And wherever you have these saved is where you're going to actually, of course, be setting what the minimum and the deployed build are. With the repository pattern, we can easily set up temporary values, which makes it much easier to test this. And then the last step for you is going to be, of course, adding your actual API endpoint into there. So before we actually create that, we're going to create a new class, which is going to be called the build version. And that build version is just going to hold these 2 types of values. So within the updates, we're going to be creating a new file, and this will be in the domain, and then this will be called the build version. And this is going to be a very simple class. It's just going to be 2 integers, and one is going to be the minimum build, and the next is going to be the deployed build. So back in the updates repository, we'll create that new future, and this is what would actually connect to the API and get those 2 values. And then you'll have to update this to actually parse out the API response data and convert it into a build version. But for now, we can just set these build version numbers manually while testing. And now we're going to create a provider, which is actually going to determine if the user's screen should show the force update, the optional update, or just display no update message at all. So the first step to that will be to create an update status. And this is going to be a simple enum which is going to have one of three values, which is mandatory, optional, or none. And these will correspond to what is displayed to the user. So mandatory is going to be the forced mandatory update screen. Optional will just be the alert, and then none will be showing the app as normal. So back in our update repository, we can create a new feature, which is going to return that update status. And we'll name this the device update status. Our generator has also stopped, so we're just going to go ahead and rerun that. But now we have everything we need to actually figure out the update status for an individual user. So the first thing we will do is make that call to get our build version information, which is, of course, going to be the static values right now. And we're going to check if that build version is null. And then if the build version is null, that means we aren't able to retrieve anything from here. We'll set the update status to a none type. And this is because we won't know what the minimum build or the deployed build is. So there's really nothing we can do. We just have to show the user the app without any prompts. Past this, we'll know we have the build version, so we can create two new variables, which are just simply pulling the data from build versions. And this will just make it a little bit shorter to use and write later on. The last piece of data that we're going to need is that device build, which of course we can get from the device build num, which is right up here. Now that we have these three values, we can determine which update status the current user should actually get. So the first thing we're going to check is if the minimum build is greater than the deployed build. And this should actually never happen, but of course these are going to be set manually by you. So if it does happen that the minimum build is greater than the deployed build, then we're just going to reset the minimum build to be the deployed build. This would be, for instance, if you set something like 3 for the minimum build, but the deployed build is only 2, it would actually not be possible for a user to have a higher minimum build than a deployed build, because of course the app isn't deployed on that higher version. So this is just more of a check on the data itself. Once that's done, we'll check if the device build, which is of course the current user's device version, is less than the minimum build. And if it's less than the minimum build, then we want to make it mandatory that they update, because the current user's device is not meeting the minimum build version. So if that's the case, we'll just return mandatory. So next we'll be checking if the device build is less than the deployed build. And if that is the case, we'll have an optional update status, because the minimum build is met, but the deployed build is further on. So this would be the case if we had something like this, a minimum build of 1, the current build is 2, and the deployed build was 3. So this would prompt the user to actually update. And then finally, if neither of these two are met, we're just going to return none for the update status. So this is going to be it for the device update status function. And now we can create a provider that is just going to return that. This is going to be very similar to our device build provider. It's just going to be a device update status provider, and it will return that update status. So now that we have this provider, we can use it to determine if we want to display either the optional update or the mandatory update. So we'll begin by doing the optional update. And for this, we'll create a new file in the presentation, and we'll call it the optional update card. And I'm not going to fully cover how to style this, but again, the code will be available. So let me paste in here the final version, and I'll explain it as we go. We are going to be listening to this provider that we just created. And then since this is going to be an async value, we do need to have a loading state, an error state, and a data state. Now, when this is loading or error, we don't want to show anything because there's nothing really to show here. If there is no data, then that means there's no update status to show. And then we're going to want to check if that update status is optional, because we only want to show this card if it is optional. And you'll see that there's an else down here that also just shows nothing if the update status is not optional. I'm going to wait a second on this launch URL and we'll come back to it. So now we have this optional update card. And we can copy this and go back over into the main.dart. And then where we have this column here above our current build, we can just go ahead and add that optional update card. And we will need to import that. And if we rerun the app, you'll see nothing happens. And that is because our current version is 2, but in our update repository, our minimum version is 2 and our deployed version is 2. So if we set our deployed build to something higher, such as 3, and we rerun the app, you'll see now we get the optional update alert. And we're just going to go back into the build and add a couple spacers above and below the other information, so that just pushes that up to the top. If we want this link to the App Store on iOS and the Play Store on Android, we can set up this link using the URL launcher package. So we're going to add that package. And we're also going to create a new file to hold the URL value as a constant. And this we'll just call constants.dart. And this is going to be pretty simple, but we're going to have a string that's returned as a store URL. And then we're going to be returning a different value if we're on Android or if we're on iOS. These are just examples of my apps, but you would obviously want to change this to be the Google Play Store URL or the Apple App Store URL. But now we can use this store URL back in our optional update card. And I'm going to uncomment this code now. And we can then import the URL launcher and the constants. And then once you have this set in here with the launch mode of external application, if you were to click this on an actual device, it will work, but on the simulator, it will not work. You're also going to need to completely rerun the app on the simulator because a new package was added, which is going to make it crash if you don't. And now that that's loaded back up, if you do click it, you could see it would try and go to the App Store, but it's not going to work on the simulator, as I said. And now we also want to add the mandatory update card. So we'll begin that by adding a new file in the presentation. And we'll actually call this the mandatory update screen because this will be a full screen that shows up. I'm not going to show exactly how to do the styling, but if you want to look at the code on GitHub, it is going to be available. Now that we have this mandatory update screen, we're going to determine if this should be shown and then show it before even running the app. So if we go into our My App here, this is essentially our highest level. We're running the app and then we go to My App. So within this material app here is where we're going to decide if we should show the forced update screen. And the first step to this is going to be listening to this provider. Now you'll notice that the ref here is not available, and that is because My App is a stateless widget, and we need this to be a consumer widget so that we have access to the Riverpod ref. And when we do that, we also have to add widget ref here. And now we have access to the ref. Of course, since this is an async value, we will have to handle the 3 different states. This is going to happen for the home here. Instead of just returning the My Home page, we're actually going to remove that. We're going to look at that value, and then we're going to say, if it's loading, we can just put a circle progress indicator. If there's errors, we can display the error message here. And then if there's data, that means we have an update status. And if that update status is mandatory, then we can go ahead and show our mandatory update screen. If not, we'll just return the home page as normal. This is essentially placeholder stuff. You would probably want to handle this error better than just showing text here and possibly add some retry logic, but that's outside the scope of this video. So right now this should be working. We just need to change our versions to test it. So the minimum version, if we set that equal to 3, then our current build version is 2. So this should force a required update, but you can see it does so right there. So that is going to cover the 3 states of your app. What you would need to do is, of course, get this to actually pull the data from your API. And then every time you release a new build, if you do want to show the update required, then you would just set the deployed and the minimum to that newest version. However, if you wanted to allow an older version and just show that there is an update, which is probably better for minor versions, then you can do that with just using this update alert here. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, go ahead and comment down below, and I will link everything that was discussed in this video down in the description.